All right, so I wanted to do a reaction video to this talk between Matt Dillahunty and Douglas Murray, and the reason I wanted to do it is because I think this conversation that they're having about Jordan Peterson is actually incredibly emblematic of a philosophical conflict that's going on in our time between what I would call the modernist viewpoint and more of a subjectivist or symbolic viewpoint. And I think Jordan Peterson sits in the middle of that, and he's more on the symbolic slash religious side. And I think Matt Dillahunty is definitely more on the materialist side, and Douglas Murray is kind of like straddling the line because he was an ex-atheist, but now he believes in the value of different religions that he finds positive, and he also has seen that atheism has kind of given rise to the woke movement or whatever, and he's basically, and they're talking about Jordan Peterson's impact on that. I found this incredibly enlightening, and I wanted to just give my thoughts on it. So without further ado, let's begin.
I spent part of this morning watching your event with Jordan Peterson a couple of days ago. I'm doing some events with him in London coming up, and I was fascinated by it, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts about it that I might have missed.
So just as an aside, I watched that debate and I found it very frustrating. So I guess we'll see what Matt Dillahunty has to say about it.
Has anyone here seen it? Probably quite a few people. Yeah, it's an amazing conversation, I think. And
I put out a video that on my Atheist Debates channel, giving most of my thoughts to it. I am still confused and more than a little irritated.
Right.
Because I know.
I'm not confused, but I am irritated. But let's hear why he's confused.
I know that he had conversations with Sam Harris, and the first one was awful and painful because they couldn't come to some understanding about what truth was.
Yeah.
And for me, truth is that which comports with reality.
All right, so this is why he's confused and irritated, because his definition of truth is radically simplistic. So if you are paying attention to what he just said, he views truth as that which comports with reality, plain and simple, but that's actually a circular reasoning. So that implies he knows what reality is, which let's just say he doesn't know what reality is. For the sake of argument, we're going to assume that Matt Dillahunty is not omniscient as to the absolute state of reality. So this is a very common error with modernists and rationalists and people who are stuck in the paradigm of like the pre-idealist philosophers, like the materialist, reductionist type of people, is that they think they confuse their belief system with reality. They cite pragmatic results as why their belief system is in line with reality, and they miss the fact that material reductionism has yielded specific kinds of results. That does not mean it's a complete theory of reality. And if you press them on this, they will say, of course, we don't know if everything is materialistic or rational or straightforward or not. But Jordan Peterson knows that, and he acts like the modernists are an incomplete theory. People like Sam Harris and Matt Dillahunty, to my knowledge, are in this very literalistic mindset, and they see religion as a scientific theory that's wrong, whereas Jordan Peterson doesn't. He views the scientific materialist model as an incorrect model because he understands that it misses very key things like subjective experience, and if you're measuring everything based on what you can see and ignoring the subjective and what you can feel, you're going to miss a lot about the way the human mind and the world interact. So anyway, moving forward.
Done. Or at least that's the truth I care about. Once we start talking about, oh, well, it's true for me, or it's true in a metaphorical sense, I realize that you can inspire people and even educate them with analogies and stories and things, but I care about whether something's really true.
Okay, so what I would say to this is that Matt Dillahunty, I'm going to assume, is a liberal who believes in things like human rights and that kind of thing. So he definitely has things that he believes in that he cannot see or prove that don't necessarily comport with reality. And one might wonder why he believes in such things if he can't see a human right or prove it or anything like that. But I think his statement is kind of self-contradictory, but I don't want to take up too much time. I'm going to keep moving.
There's a gentleman that messaged me on Twitter, and he's written a big piece about this thing that I did with Jordan because he thinks I'm just monumentally wrong about what people actually believe about the existence of God. And he's like, most people, who believe that God exists don't actually believe that God exists. And I just think that's monumentally arrogant and dismissive. How dare you? I mean, there are probably people who have a metaphorical view of God that's fine for them, or that they believe in. But I know what I grew up with. I know what's popular and evangelical and fundamentalist. If you go up to them and say, you don't actually believe that there's a God, you'll find out fairly quickly that they are at least willing to defend the idea that they do.
They might even thump you for Jesus.
They might. Yeah, punch me in my fat face for Jesus. That was one of my favorite threats.
Well, that definitely sheds some light into his upbringing. I have definitely said on this channel that the American Protestant evangelical tradition that views Christianity as incredibly, incredibly literal and like a scientific historical document, miracles and warts and all, is one that's not necessarily true to the original faith and intent of Christianity. There's definitely been a lot of more interesting takes that are more metaphorical. Early church fathers, for instance, were very interested in viewing different ways of viewing scripture, and they would view it as like metaphorical. Of course, they didn't use the word metaphor, but that's what they were getting at. There's also the issue of people having a hierarchical view of belief. So, like, for instance, take something like science. Take a belief system like science, right? You have a scientist who's been doing putting his nose to the grindstone for 30 years to come up with these abstract theories, and then they get filtered down through journalists to the average person, and then the average person assumes that it's true. That average person is not doing any science. They're regurgitating information. And in very much the same way, your average religious person of any religion, even though they're a believer and they get benefits from being a believer, such as a common culture and moral framework and everything, and they'll fight to defend it because they have so much riding on it, like maybe their whole family is part of that religion or something, and they wouldn't know how to live without it. Like, they are going to act as though it's literally true because they don't understand that there are different ways that something can be true. So, like, stupid people exist, and you're not going to, like, get rid of them, unless you're, like, a eugenicist or something. Even then, you're not going to get rid of them. So, like, you have to account for the fact that people vary in their understanding. So, like, your average dude who grew up in the Bible Belt is probably going to have one type of truth that he subscribes to, and that's literal. And, like, the only thing that's different about his literal truth and Dillahunty's, like, materialism or whatever, like objective materialism, is that, like, the Christian guy, at least in theory, has a moral framework that he can, like, that's, like, compatible if you assume the first principles are true. And, like, versus Dillahunty's kind of, like, nebulous humanism, which itself is an extension of the Judeo-Christian belief system. Anyway, moving forward.
But when I look back at the discussion, there were things that I loved about it in the sense that we were, it's frustrating to me that I can sometimes have conversations with people I disagree with much more easily than I can with, for example, some of my friends on the left who've decided that because I'm not willing to punch people for for saying things that are awful that I'm a Nazi sympathizer, and will go out of their way to say this.
Right.
So it's frustrating.
That left-wing authoritarianism is a direct extension of the liberal tradition that spawned secular humanism. So liberalism is baby wokeism. So the fact that he's complaining about, like, basically wokeism, it's like, dude, new atheists are the reason that wokeism, like, happened in the first place. Like, the deconstructionist and, like, all these, like, Marxist criticisms of religion, like it's the opiate of the masses or whatever, that is, like, pre-woke belief system. So the fact that he doesn't understand that just shows that he's a little bit lost.
Because I disagree with. I don't think Jordan values skepticism. He kind of scoffed at it under his breath, and I wish I would have addressed that more. I think that's the biggest regret from the conversation I had. But I was happy with that we didn't spend a whole bunch of time talking about truth, except that it concerns me that with the fuzziness of how he talks about it, that maybe every single objection I had can be dismissed by saying, well, he didn't mean that true in reality. When he says you can't quit smoking without a mystical experience, that atheists would actually be murderers.
The reference to crime and punishment.
Yes.
That was very interesting, yeah.
I don't know that Jordan necessarily said that atheists would necessarily be murderers. I do think he would say that there's no particularly good reason for somebody who believes that life has no purpose and, like, not to justify not being a murderer. So that's definitely a thing.
I'm still not convinced of what he believes about the reality that we, as far as I can tell, share. But to say that Soviet Russia was a secular humanist...
I could see that was a bit that really got on your tits.
It did.
Yeah,
because you can say it's atheist, and I'll agree all day long. And it was all... You could also say that it was, you could try to make an argument that it was because of atheism, but you can't really get anywhere from atheism to, therefore, we should kill people and have this particular... You might as well start with his mustache and say, mustachioed dictators are awful.
Not having a moral framework to base your society on is a precondition. It's not a necessary precondition, but it definitely makes it a lot easier to justify secular utopianism that Soviet Russia was. I will agree that Soviet Russia was definitely not a secular humanist. It was definitely secular, but I don't think it was humanist. But saying that the immorality and belief system of Russia was due to Stalin's mustache is on the same level of explanatory power that it was due to the secular values of, like, Karl Marx and, like, Lenin. I don't think that's a defensible claim in any way, shape, or form. Now, you could say that Christians did the Crusades and witch burnings and whatnot. And, I'm not saying that people are perfect, but I am saying that they were objectively doing the wrong thing from the standpoint of their belief system when they were doing that. And I don't think you could say the same thing about an atheistic society killing people. So,
yeah, I thought it was fascinating. It was really interesting, the points at which you really were clearly at loggerheads. Well, one was that issue. A thought occurred to me, though, that Jordan clearly has a pretty bleak, you might say realistic, view of human nature and what it does when it's unleashed. And I share some of that. But it's possible that was one of the things that was playing out underneath that claim of his, which is, you sometimes see this, by the way, among very conservative people, that they come to quite rigid feelings about things because they actually themselves intuit where they might go unleashed.
Well, okay, so there's 2 points here. One of them is a more general point about the Hobbesian element of human nature, like sort of Lord of the Flies type. Like, there's a fundamental assumption built into liberalism that human beings in the state of nature are inherently good. It's a Rousseauian idea, and Marx also used that idea in his defense of like the utopia of the proletariat or whatever. The idea that if you just like liberated all of the working class, then all of a sudden they would be in this utopian environment. And of course that's wrong, because when you liberate anybody from all restrictions, things tend to get pretty bad pretty fast. And when you take into account the fact that like the dekulakization killed probably all the smart people in Russia, so you're just left with all the stupid people running everything, then I'm not saying that everybody who engages in working labor is stupid. I do working labor myself a lot, but like the idea that like you would want a bunch of carpenters to run your society is just not right. I mean, it's incorrect. So you need a range of people. But all of that is based on the sort of Rousseauian model of like, if you just let people alone, they'll be really good. Like John Lennon, right? Imagine there's no countries and we wouldn't have a reason to fight. Well, maybe you'd have an infinite number of reasons to fight. Maybe you'd just engage in mass hysteria, you know? And then there's a more personal claim about like very conservative people, like where would they go if they got unleashed? And it's like they'd probably go to about the same place that everybody else goes when they're released from all limitations and restrictions. I mean, it's actually very hard to justify a moral claim in the absence of some guiding document that's getting you through it. So, I mean, you can do it, but like most people can't. And, you know, maybe a very intelligent person can be like Mr. Secular Humanist, Nietzschean Ubermensch, I create my own values, but like most people aren't going to get there, and if they do try, they'll usually end up in a much worse place than they would have got with some guiding religious document. So I don't think that you have to necessarily be a radical conservative to end up in a very dark place if you disinhibit yourself. I think liberals, leftists, moderate conservatives, centrists, all of those people have their own version of extreme pathology when they're unchained and from all limitations. And, I think to focus that on radical conservatives is misguided, to say the least, and maybe a little bit self-blind. But anyway, moving on.
And that seemed to me to be sort of abundantly there in what he was saying. And I find his attitude towards religion fascinating. He reminds me of the philosopher Roger Scruton a bit, because Scruton, I think he's written a lot about religion, but I think that if you really dug down and you said to him, for instance, do you believe in the physical resurrection? He would want to not answer that question.
I think that's actually a sign of incredible humility. That you can understand that something has a particular set of values and moral values, and then you don't have to look at it as a literal historical thing. That's true for all religions. Like, you can gain the value of understanding that religion without believing it to be the only one with value or the only true one or even true at all in a literal historical sense. So anyway.
And that's what
I think that's where Jordan is as well. And I'm not putting any views onto him that I think are dishonest, but I think that he has a real fear of saying something which he thinks would cause damage in a way if he did it.
Well, that's the one question that I asked him that I had prepared ahead of time based on what I knew, and that was, what is it that you fear we will lose if people give up a belief in a God? And he started with, well, we'll lose the narrative, the metaphorical substrate of the narrative, blah, blah, blah. But that doesn't tell me anything, because it doesn't tell me what of the narrative is of value that we're losing.
Right.
See Nietzsche's prediction about the rivers of Europe running red with blood due to socialism.
And then when I pressed on that, he just said art, as if there's not... Well, the problem is that I could say there's tons of art from atheists, except that he also doesn't seem to think there are any atheists.
Right.
He thinks everyone is religious and that people are just professing atheism, but they've made... None of this meshes with... Certainly it reminds me when I'm in debates with Christian apologists and they say, oh, you're not really an atheist, you actually are just publicly denying that you exist, you believe in a God. or you actually know that a God exists.
Well, I can't speak for those Christian apologists, but Jordan Peterson is coming at this from a Jungian perspective, and what Jung defined as a god or a spirit is basically a very universal pattern of behavior that exists in the human mind, in every human mind, in the collective unconscious. So, like, for instance, every time you get angry, you're invoking the god of war. And some people will say, like, well, why not just call it anger? It's located inside the brain, and, well, it's not inside the brain, for one, because it's inside every single brain, and it's even inside animal brains. So that's one reason. Like, if it's a universal thing that's in every single person and every single society, regardless of their belief systems about that god, then, or about that spirit, then, like, it's not just some idiosyncratic, subjective thing. It has an independent reality, because otherwise you wouldn't recognize the commonalities when one person gets angry or another person gets angry. And there might be individual differences in how they manifest that, but, and then some people might say, well, why do you have to, like, call it a god or a spirit? I'm like, you can use whatever freaking term you want. I don't care about the terms you use. But the fact that there are commonalities across these different states of psychic being, or psychological being, if you prefer that term, shows that there's some underlying metaphysical thing that exists in every single person across all people, and it's relevant, and it is a personality. It's not a machine, it's not some construct, it's not an idea. It's at minimum a transpersonal personality, and it's even a trans-species personality, because we recognize that type of thing in, like, dogs and stuff. So, anyway, that's what Jordan Peterson means by God. Now, I can't speak to the Christian apologist. I don't know what those guys believe, except I know that most of them are not fit for public debate.
And that comes from, I did a debate with Cy ten Bruggencate, who's a presuppositionalist, and that's his big thing. We all know that God exists, including you. You're just, lying or whatever. And he's
that guy sounds like a dick.
mocked for it. And yet in reality, Jordan did exactly the same thing, essentially saying, you atheists are professing atheists, that, a real atheist would be a cold-blooded killer who would, rationalize and justify this way. You can't have a moral foundation that is secular. And he tried to use AI. Anyway, I don't want to go.
Okay, so it is true that you can't have, you can have a moral foundation that's secular, but you can't have one that's not based on faith. Because, like, for instance, I would say that Matt Dillahunty is probably a liberal, and he gains his, moral foundations from the liberal tradition, and the liberal tradition is an extension of the Protestant tradition, because in both the French and American Revolution, which was the birthplace of modern liberalism, you have people who were essentially like Protestants and who were essentially Protestants, rebelling against the idea of God, but keeping all the same Protestant values. So humanism is a form of Protestantism. It's just like an atheistic version of Protestantism, in very much the same way that, like, a penguin is a flightless bird. The fact that a penguin can't fly doesn't detract from it being a bird. It's a taxonomical error. You could have a godless religion. It's based on faith. God does not make it a religion. Anyway.
Through the whole evening. But it was essentially the same thing I get from unschooled, uneducated apologists.
It's not, because they're not coming at it from a Jungian perspective. They're saying you have to believe in my God. Whereas Jordan Peterson has a very specific definition of what a god or a spirit is that actually coincides with reality. And he's not, that's why he doesn't say, I believe in Jesus Christ. He says, psychologically speaking, Jesus is a symbol of the self, or a solar symbol, which is true. That's what he is. And you don't have to, you can be an atheist and still understand that that exists. That's why when they ask Carl Jung, do you believe in God? He says, I don't believe, I know. So.
On behalf of a much more strict view of religion. And that's why earlier, you may be right about what he's afraid of. And I tried to get to what he's afraid of. But when you were talking about suggesting that we may have lost something and encouraging people to go back to church for that, I didn't know how similar those things were. I
No,
think
I'm
there's a difference.
I'm slightly towards the direction of some of that. I mean, I don't want to belabor this, but just one example. A little while ago, after a talk, a young man, a student, came over to ask a question afterwards, and he said, this was a real warning flash, you'll know this. He said, I don't understand why you don't talk about IQ differentials.
Because you're Douglas Murray and not Charles Murray?
Yes, exactly. And there's no relation. But he said, I don't understand why you don't talk about IQ differentials. Interesting subject that might be. It's not a specialism of mine, and so on. But it's also something more than that. And you often find this in conversations with people. You unearth something you thought or were worried about, which you just hadn't found the right way of addressing. And I was sort of trying to dodge this young guy, because to me it's a little bit like somebody coming over to me and saying, why don't you ever talk about the Jews?
Okay, so he could have just stopped with the, IQ differentials are not something that I've studied. I'm a journalist. I'm not a psychometrician. I'm not a neuroscientist. Like, I don't study this. That's fine. That would have been entirely plausible and reasonable to say. But when he says that IQ is racist, that's just completely irrational. Like, you might as well say that, like, I don't know, height is racist or something. It's like, that's just a dumb thing to say, but, that is what it is.
Moving swiftly on, but this young man who said this to me, I was sort of struck. He kept pushing at this, and I realized that I had a number of reasons for wanting to dodge this, and not just it wasn't my specialism, but I ended up saying to him that, look, you may want to keep delving into that and so on, but I said, first of all, I'm just not sure what you can do about that. And secondly, I said to him, I finally realized what it was. I said, I just would feel nervous about a future in which people were really interested in IQ difference, and where we lost a sense of, in a religious or atheistic sense, the sanctity of the individual.
Okay, so you can't have, it's very difficult to have atheistic sanctity, because you can make the same argument for atheistic non-sanctity of anything, because you're basically just superimposing your opinion upon something. Now, somebody might say that, oh, well, in religion, you're just superimposing your opinion on that, and I guess from an atheist perspective, that would make sense. I guess I'm going to table that for now, but my point is that if you don't have anything that's sacred, any foundation that's sacred, you can't really have an account of any moral value that's logically coherent. You have to take something on faith. Maybe you can take it on faith without a God, but that's probably fine, but you have to have some, not necessarily justification, but I think the reason that gods are so popular is that human belief systems are not equations. Human belief systems are embodied states, and gods are embodied states. So that's one thing. The other thing, too, is like, he says, why would you worry about IQ differentials? It's like, well, for one thing, it is a pretty good inoculation against arguments of systemic racism, right? Like, if you look at, for instance, and, they're not afraid of making this argument about the gender wage gap. It's like, well, why do men and women, make different amounts of money on average? It's like, well, because men and women have different goals, men and women have different, sexual, like, proclivities, men and women have different, like, personality traits, like, and that's tied to their biology, and that's fine. Nobody really refutes that, except for, like, idiot socialists on YouTube who are stuck in this idea of, like, militant equity or whatever, militant fraternism. But, like, the idea that, it's like, well, why does the black community underperform the Ashkenazi Jewish community? It's like, well, nobody has any problem talking about, like, the racial IQ gaps that are, like, an average of 30 points between the average American black person and the average Ashkenazi Jew. it's like a 30-point IQ differential would definitely explain why, like, despite composing like less than 1% of the population, Jews are accounted for like 50% of all the Nobel Prizes, and black people are like just a tiny little fraction. Like, everybody's fine saying that about why, like, there's only one woman Nobel Science Prize, but like nobody's okay talking about the black and Jewish and white and Asian thing. Like, really? We're going to ignore one set of biological differences and focus on, and use one as a form of explanatory power? Like, how does that make you different than a feminist? Anyway, moving on.
And it clarified for me that sometimes you see how a pile-up can happen, and you didn't realize that was why you didn't want anything to do with it. But that was the case with this young man, I'm sure.
Coward.
There's people who press on a number of issues. I'm exactly with you. One of the reasons that I'm advocating so much in this year and more than the past, I'm an atheist, but I'm also a secular humanist, and I also value human life and human dignity. And as somebody who was given IQ tests as a kid and had specific things done to me as a result of those scores, I know people with IQs higher than mine who are boneheadedly stupid, and people who have incredibly low IQs who are brilliant at things. And I care more about what people believe, because the beliefs inform the actions, and mostly I care about whether or not those beliefs are reasonable.
Okay, well, I hate to tell you this, but your beliefs are unreasonable, Matt Dillahunty, about IQ, because this is no different than when people say things like, well, men and women are different in terms of their physical strength, and you say something like, well, what about like Ronda Rousey? Ronda Rousey could kick like 99% of men's asses. It's like, no shit, she's a female MMA fighter. The fact that, like, for one, the fact that he says somebody who he knows has a high IQ and is boneheadedly stupid, it's like, well, by definition, the guy with the high IQ, assuming the test was done correctly, is not boneheadedly stupid. That's a definition of not being boneheadedly stupid. He might be lazy. He might not have certain talents. He might have crippling anxiety that prevents him from, achieving the phenotypic maximum of his intelligent potential, of the potential of his intelligence. But he's not stupid. He might just not be motivated. So this is when somebody cites a statistic and then you say, well, I know an individual who violates that statistic. It's like, good for you. Statistics don't pertain to individuals, they pertain to groups. And he knows that, and he's selectively, like, if somebody did this to him on like a question about radical feminism or something like that, he would be the first one to call it out in exactly the way that I'm doing it. And I hate the fact that he cherry picks where he seems to understand statistics and where he doesn't. It's really, really dumb and dishonest. Anyway.
Because I want to make sure that, I've said I want to believe as many true things, as few false things as possible. That's me.
No, you don't.
Cribbing Hume in a more hip fashion. But it's true, and you have to have both parts of that. And it seems to me that anytime we start trying to quantify the value of people, doing math with souls, doing the collateral damage math, doing the what's your IQ, how many Twitter followers do you have?
Are you a man or a woman?
How many? All of these things distract from whether or not what this person has said is reasonable and accurate.
Well, unfortunately, what Matt Dillahunty said is not reasonable or accurate, and since he also doesn't believe in a soul, I'm just going to assume that he's selectively being dishonest, and whether that's on accident or just a function of his negligence, that's truly unfortunate.
And you always get to that position that any avid reader will always be confronted by at some point, which is that somebody who's never read a book can be the loveliest person you know.
Yeah, but whether they're lovely or not is not a function of their IQ score. So that was really disappointing into that conversation. I think their willingness to selectively use logic and statistics because of their feelings is is unfortunate and stupid. And I think the doing math with souls thing, if you're not comfortable doing math with souls, you're going to have a really hard time defending the gender binary, for instance, and defending why people are, not supposed to be able to cut their genitals off, which I know that's something that both of them believe, or at least I know Douglas Murray firmly believes that. But you know who wouldn't have a problem saying that you shouldn't cut somebody's genitals off because of doing math with souls, quote unquote, is Jordan Peterson. And that's because Jordan Peterson understands a certain irrational element of the moral dimension, and he understands that way better than I know he understands that better than Matt Dillahunty, and that's why Matt Dillahunty is confused and irritated by him. So I hope this has shed some light on this topic, why atheism is an incomplete belief system, and I hope this talk has been informative, if not in the way that Matt Dillahunty wished it would be informative.